Hi, in today's video we're going to look at expansions in HISE. So an expansion is a way of delivering extra content to your end users, and you can deliver extra content with the existing preset browser system, but that's kind of limited to just sample maps and samples. With an expansion you can deliver a whole load of new content, including impulse responses, new graphics, and even new code. And this can be added into their existing installation. So for example, you could make a player plugin and each expansion could be a different instrument. If you've seen the Perk X library by Audict, you'll have seen that they have different percussion add-ons and each of those is a HISE expansion. So expansions aren't exactly official yet in HISE. It's kind of experimental. Currently there isn't a built-in installer for the end user, so you're going to have to make your own installer. But apart from that, they're very usable and I think they can be used in a real-world application. I haven't yet delivered any to my customers, but I'm working on a project at the moment that will use them. So I've got a blank project here on the desktop, this folder called Expansion Demo. There's nothing in here yet. This is what we're looking at though, this is the project. I also have some samples in a separate folder. I've got some clarinet samples and some flute samples. If you're one of my higher level Patreon supporters, you'll get a copy of this project along with the samples so you can follow along with what I'm doing in this video. Something else you might have noticed, I've changed the resolution on my monitor, so hopefully this video format will work out a bit better for you guys who watch this on smaller screens. I usually record at full resolution on my 2K monitor, but I know that doesn't come out as well on laptops and things like that. So let me know if this is better for you, and hopefully it doesn't affect the quality of the video too much. But when you're downscaling, there's always some slight loss of quality, unfortunately. Let's go and add a main interface script. Okay, so we're just where we usually are. We've got the main interface. If we go to the API browser and we type in here expansion, we can see here all of the functions that are available to us for working with expansions. Now this is something important. If you don't see these API calls, or when you try and use them they don't work, that means you need to rebuild HISE and enable a few flags to turn on the expansions feature. So when you go to build HISE, you need to open the producer project. You need to go to High Core and scroll down until you find this one here, HISE Enable Expansions, and make sure that's set to Enabled. And then you also need to go to the exporters, and it will depend on your operating system whether you're going to go to the Mac one, the Visual Studio one, or the Linux one. But you just need to go to the one for your operating system and just click on the header for it, and where you've got this extra preprocessor definitions box, you need to add in here HISE underscore enable underscore expansions equals 1 and HISE underscore enable underscore expansion underscore editing equals 1. And then you need to rebuild HISE, and then the expansions should work and these API calls should work. And the first one we're going to be interested in is the get expansion list function. And what this will do is it'll return a list of all the expansions that we've made available in the project. Or when the plugin is compiled, it will return a list of the expansions that the user has installed. First of all, we're going to need to create some expansions. So we're going to create, as the samples imply, we're going to create a clarinet expansion and a flute expansion. So if we go into our project file, we're going to create a new folder in here called expansions. And then inside here, we're going to create one called flute and one called clarinet. So you just call them whatever your expansion packs are going to be. Now, each of these expansions is essentially going to be its own little mini HISE project without the scripting folders and without some of the other folders. But it's going to contain samples, sample maps, user presets, and audio files and additional source code. So those are the folders we're going to need in there. We can also put MIDI files and images in the expansion as well. So let's just copy those from here. So I'm just going to highlight samples, sample maps, MIDI files, images, audio files, additional source code, and user presets. I think that's all of them. Okay, let's copy those, and then we'll go back into our expansions folder, and inside the clarinet folder we'll paste a copy of those, and the same in our flute folder. The last thing we need in each expansion is a little XML file to give it some data about the expansion. So we're just going to create a new document, and it's going to be called expansion_info.xml. And I'm going to open that in a text editor. And I'm just going to paste this in. This is what you need to put in there. It's just a little bit of XML code. So we've got a little heading there. And then this is the information about the expansion. And the two bits that are most important are the name and the version number. The project name might be important in certain situations, but we're not going to worry about that today. So the name for this one is going to be Flute. And then I'll just duplicate this XML document and put it in the clarinet file. And we'll change the name in this one to clarinet. And if you were to update the version of your expansion, you'd change the version number here. So it's not always necessary to create these expansions manually in the way I just showed you, but I've shown you that so that you can figure out exactly what's going on here and see where these files sort of come from. But actually within HISE, we can generate the expansion folder structure and that XML file automatically if we go to the sampler workspace, and up here over at the top left you'll see this expansion section, and if you're not seeing this it's because you need to rebuild HISE with those flags enabled that I showed you earlier. And to create a new expansion, just click this button here, and this will load to your project folder's expansions folder. And you can just create a new folder for the new expansion, so we'll just call this new expansion. And then once you're in that folder, you just need to click OK, and HISE will have created that folder structure for you. So there's the new expansions folder, and if we go inside there, we can see the folder structure has been created, and we've even got the XML file, which has the same data, and it's put the name of the expansion in there for us. There are some other expansion editing options here. For example, you can select an expansion and then you can see just the files that are related to that particular expansion. You can see the samples that are there for that expansion as well. There's this option to encode the expansion pack. This doesn't actually do anything at the moment. You'd need to write a custom C++ encoding module to get that to do anything. So really the only purpose I've found for this little editor so far is the creation of a new expansion and filtering to the files that are part of that expansion. So now we've got two expansions. We need to put the samples in now. So I had a folder on the desktop called samples. One's got clarinet samples, one's got flute samples. So we'll take the flute samples first of all. I'm just cutting those. And we'll paste those into our flute expansions samples folder. And then I'm going to do the same with the clarinet. So now the clarinet samples are in the clarinet expansions samples folder, and the flute samples are in the flute expansions samples folder. So we've got two expansions created. We can go back into HISE and we can start playing with these API calls that we've got here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a list of all the expansions in our project. So we'll do const var expansions. So we'll just make a variable called expansions, and then we'll call engine.get expansion list. And I'll hit F5 on this and we'll have a look at that variable up here now, expansions. Let's get rid of that for now, we don't need that. So we've got it here, and if I right click on it, it looks a bit strange, it looks like an array. And if we have a look at the value, we can see it contains two objects. So we right click on it, it just looks a bit strange, but here we can see it's two objects. So each of these objects is actually our expansions. So the get expansion list function returns an array of expansion objects. And if we again go to the API browser, we can see we actually have an expansion object and then the functions associated with that object. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through this expansions collection, and we're going to pull out some data about the expansions. So we'll go for E in expansions. So that just means go through each expansion and stick the object in this E variable. And we're going to create a new variable inside the loop called P, and this is going to be equal to e.getProperties. And this getProperties function is over here, so we can read about that there. And let's just start by printing out the properties. And oh, the properties is an object as well. So what we need to do is trace P. And I'll hit F5. Now this is interesting. So you can see it's found two expansions, but they're called Nylon Guitar and Sophia Harp, rather than our flute and clarinet. This is a finicky thing. Basically, I was working on another project which had these two expansions in it, and when I switched to this project, I didn't close HISE first and reopen it, and that's confused HISE, and it's actually pulling up the expansions from the other project. So I'm going to save this and then close HISE and reopen the project, and this should be sorted. But this is a good point. If you do notice weird stuff like this, or sometimes the expansions list will just return empty, it probably means you've been switching between projects and you just need to restart HISE. So let's just refresh this and hit F5. And there we go. Now we can see our flute and our clarinet expansion. And you can see it's pulled in the version number and the project name. So that is all of the data that we had in this expansion info XML file. So we've got the flute, the version number, and the project name. So those are bits of data that you can use within your script if you need to. And the one I find most useful, of course, is the name for displaying that to the user. So let's make another constant variable. We'll call it expansion names. And this will be an array. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the name of each expansion into the array. So we can get rid of this console print thing now, and we can just go expansion names.push p.name. And we know it's going to be with a capital N because that's how it's written down here, where we printed it out into the console. So let's just hit compile. And now we can see our expansion names array over here, and it's got the two names in there. So now that we've got the names, we can add these to the user interface. And there's a load of ways we could do this. We could have a drop-down menu, we could have buttons, we could have a knob to switch between the expansions, and we could display the expansion name in a label. So let's add something to our GUI. So I think first of all we'll have a preset browser. And this will come in handy in a little while. So we'll add a preset browser. There we go, and we'll just customize this. We'll get rid of that notes bar at the top. We don't need that. And we'll leave the colors as they are, that's fine. And I think for this one we'll use a drop down menu. We'll use a combo box for our expansion names. And let's call this CMB expansions. And we should name our preset browser as well. We'll call this FLT preset. And that will do for the GUI for now. So the first thing to do is to populate our drop-down list, and we can do that easily because we've got the expansion names here. All we have to do is put them into a string, and that can populate this list. So we'll grab a reference. Where is it? We'll grab a reference to the list, and then we will set it. So we'll go cmb expansions.set items expansion names.join, and we need to put a /n in there just so it puts each one on a new line. There we go. So let's just put some comments in here. So we'll call this grab list of expansions array to store expansion names get expansion names. And this will be the combo box. Okay, so now we need to set up an action for this combo box. We need it to change the loaded expansion when we change the option in the combo box. So we'll create a custom callback. And if we go back to our API browser and type expansions, we can see we've got this function which is engine set current expansion, and it wants the string which is the expansion name, so that's going to be really easy for us to get. So we're just going to call in here engine.set current expansion. And then there's two ways we could get the name. We could either use the get text function. Let's see what it's called. Combo box get item text. We could do that, or we could use the value of the combo box and pull the name out of our names array. It doesn't really matter which way we do it. I think I'll just use the item text. So we'll do component dot get item text, and that will now load the expansion. I'm just going to turn off the save in preset option for our combo box. So that's this one here, because I don't want it to automatically do it when I open the project or when I reload the project. So we'll hit compile there. And now we can choose an option from here, but we're not going to see anything happen because we haven't told it to do anything yet. We need some sort of action to take place. So I think the first thing we should do is when we change the expansion, we should get it to load in the correct sample map. And we haven't made any sample maps yet for our expansion. So we're in the, here's the project folder, we're going to expansions, let's go into the clarinet, for example. We've got the samples, but we don't have a sample map. So let's create a sample map for the clarinet expansion. So we don't even have a sampler. Let's add a sampler. And now we'll drag in the samples. And we'll use the auto mapper of HISE to quickly map these. So we can ignore all of these, I think. So now we'll click save. And okay, so this is interesting. It's popped up into the flute sample maps folder by default. And the reason for that is I bet the last one we loaded was the flute. So let's load the clarinet. And now we'll hit save. And now we're in the clarinet sample maps folder. So that was important. And we'll call this sustain.xml. Just so we're clear, we'll call it clarinet sustain.xml. And now we're going to switch to the flute, and we'll map the flute samples. So if we just clear this out, create a new sample map, and we'll hit save, and we'll call this flute sustain.xml. Okay, so now we've got a sample map for each of our expansions. And because we're selected currently on the flute expansion, when I click the drop down here, we're only seeing the flute sample maps. And you'll also notice that in the sample map name, it doesn't just have the name of the sample map, it's got this exp ::flute before the sample map name. So this is actually telling us that it's getting this sample map from an expansions folder. It's not getting it from the main sample maps folder, which doesn't have anything in. So now let's add our load sample map function. So we'll call it inline function load sample map. And the first thing we'll need is a reference to our sampler. So we'll create a generic script reference and we'll put this right at the top. That's our sampler. And we're going to do sampler1 as sampler dot, is it load sample map? Let's see, load sample map, yeah. Load sample map. And then in here we need to put the name of the sample map. Now, because we're dealing with expansions and we've got this little bit before the sample map name to deal with, we have to put that in there as well. So we're going to start the name of our sample map with exp : and then we need to put in the name of the expansion, so that would either be flute or clarinet. And rather than having to write this out twice, what we can actually do is we can just get it from the combo box. We can just grab the name, so we can do plus, so we're doing string concatenation, we can do plus cmb expansions dot get item text, and then another plus, and then we just finish that off with a curly brace like that. And now we need to add the sample map name, so that's either going to be flute underscore sustain or clarinet underscore sustain. And you know what, if we just call them sustain and get rid of the flute and clarinet part, then it's a bit easier, isn't it? Because all we'd have to do is type sustain.xml in here. So yeah, let's do that. Let's just change that. Instead of having flute sustain, we'll just call it sustain. Hopefully this won't break anything. I'll call that one sustain. So that should be about right for loading the sample maps. And we just have to make sure this function is called when we change the sample map, so we'll put it in the combo box callback. Load sample map. And I'm going to hit F5 and hope that nothing crashes. Perfect. Okay, now let's actually change the expansion and see if that function works. And we're getting an error message. So let's see, line 30. Here we go. Load sample map unknown. So, okay, that's because I've done sampler1.asSampler. That should have parentheses at the end. And now if I hit F5 and try that again, it should work, I think. So watch this drop down here. Now we'll change to the clarinet. There we go. And the flute. So that works. So now we're not switching presets, we're actually switching the expansion. And at the moment it's not doing anything too dramatic, but it's quite a powerful thing because this is our project folder and we don't have any sample maps or any samples in here. So we could compile this as a VST or an AU plugin and send it to a customer. And then at a later date we can send them an expansion which essentially has a whole HISE project inside of it. And in here is where we've got our sample maps and our samples. And you'll notice that we can even have our own user presets that are just for this particular expansion. Same with MIDI files and same with images. The image one is quite important if you want to do different images for different instruments. So if you're making a player plugin, you can do some really complicated things. You could have every single instrument in your player plugin have a completely different GUI, for example. It'd be a lot of work, but it's possible, and you could have separate images for each of your expansions. But we're just going to stick with simple stuff today, so we're not going to bother with the images. We will have a look at the additional source code. But first of all, let's look at user presets. With Christoph's help, I actually implemented the C code, C++ code, to change the user presets to correspond to the expansion folder. So that's my tiny contribution to the HISE code base. So we've got the flute here. Let's add a knob to the interface. And the only purpose of this control is to show a difference when we change presets. It's not actually going to be connected to anything. It's just so when we change presets, we can actually see that presets are being changed. So we'll add a new preset. We'll add a directory. We'll call it directory. Why not? And we'll add a category. And we'll call this flute category. I'm just putting flute in there so we can see that it has changed. And we'll add a preset. So we'll set this knob to, let's set it to 0.25. And we'll add a preset and we'll call this 0.25. And we can change the knob's value to say 0.5. And we can add another preset and we'll call this 0.5. Very imaginative. Okay, so now we've got two presets that are linked to this particular expansion. So if I change between those presets, we can see the knob changes its value so the presets are loading correctly. And if I go to the flute expansions folder and go to the user presets folder, we can see it's added the directory, the flute category, and the two presets. And now if I change the expansion to clarinet, we'll see that the preset browser automatically updates and it's got no presets in it because the clarinet doesn't yet have any presets. And if I change back to the flute, it reloads the flute presets. So now let's add some presets for the clarinet. We'll just set this to anywhere, we'll set it to 1. We'll call this one directory as well, why not? And we'll call this clarinet category. And we'll call this 1. And we'll add another one and we'll call it 0. And now I can switch between these two and the knob changes so we know that the preset is being correctly loaded. And we can change between our two sets. So we've got the flute and we've got the clarinet. And again, if we go to the clarinets expansion folder, we can see that the expansion files have been created correctly. Now we're loading the sample maps based on the expansion being changed. In actual practice, you may want to change the sample map based on the preset, just like you would usually for other projects. So you don't have to follow the exact procedure I'm doing here if that's more suitable for your particular scenario. You can still change the sample maps based on the preset and just change the presets based on the expansion. And in fact, that's what I'm doing in my project that uses expansions. I'm using the expansion to select the presets and the presets select the sample maps. Okay, so we've got preset switching working, we've got sample map loading working. What about if you want to add some extra data when the expansion changes? For example, you might want to have some information about the instrument that you're loading. An obvious example is the keyboard playable range. So if we add a keyboard to this little GUI, and we shall just, let's just close that up a bit. Okay, so now we've got a keyboard on our interface. We want to set the key colors for this. So let's have a little function that sets the key colors. So we'll do inline function, set key colors. And this is just going to loop from 0 to 127 for each MIDI note. And it'll set the keyboard colors. For now, we're just going to set them all to black, to disabled by default. And then when an expansion is selected, it will update the keyboard colors based on the selected expansion using data that we get from an external file. So let's just do our loop. And then we're going to set the keyboard color. And the key number is going to be I. And the color we're going to get from the color constants. And we're going to use the width alpha so we can add some transparency. I'll do this one black. I'll put it something like 0.3. And we shall call this function right in the onInit callback. And we'll also call it up here when the expansion gets loaded. So let's make that a bit darker actually. Okay, so our keyboard is grayed out to begin with. And when the user selects one of these expansions, that's when we're going to load in the key range. That's when we'll color some of these keys. Now, of course, for a simple example like this, you could just have an if statement which says if it's the flute, use this range. If it's the clarinet, use that range. That's a way to do it. Another way is to actually grab the key range from the sample map. You could just check which keys are mapped, but in more complicated instruments that might not be such a good option because you might have multiple ranges for different articulations. So I'm going to show you how to do this from an external file, and again this is just a simple example. You could use it to load in a lot more data. In my real world projects I use it to load in articulation information about the expansions, number of dynamics and round robins, and all kinds of stuff like that. So we'll start with the clarinet, and we're going to go to this additional source code directory. And in here we can put JSON format files, which is basically a JavaScript object. And we'll call it data.json. You can give it another name if you prefer. and we'll just open this in a text editor. And what we're going to do is create a JSON object. So that's going to be just like a JavaScript object. And in here we can put data, which is in key value pairs. So we could have a key called range and a value that's an array. And we could say the lowest number is 0 and the highest number is 127, for example. And then you could have another key, and maybe it's called articulations. And this could be, let's just make sure we put that colon in. And this could be an array. It could be an object. It could just be a text. It could just be a text string, or it could be a number. So you can just put any of your usual data in here as if you're dealing with a JavaScript object. So we're only interested in the range for now. So we'll just call it range, and we just need to check what the range actually is for the clarinet. So it's 50 to 94 that we have mapped here. So we'll put that in here. And I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to do exactly the same for the flute. Except we'll put in the correct range for the flute. Call it data.json. And make a JSON object. Range. And let's check what the range is for the flute. So that's 60 to 93. And we'll save that one as well. So let's add a variable up at the top here, and we'll call it expansion data. And actually let's make it a reg variable because the data might change. And it's going to hold the JSON file loaded from expansion. Okay, so back in our combo boxes callback, before we load the sample maps and before we change the key colors, but after we've loaded the expansion, so after this function, we're going to call this one here, which is expansion load data file. And if I right click on that, you can see load data file expects a relative path, and that relative path is relative to the additional source code directory. So we're in the additional source code directory anyway, so we can just call data.json. We don't have to do anything fancy with the path. And we're going to call this on the expansion object, so it will automatically get it from that particular expansion's additional source code folder. So the first thing is we need to get that particular expansion. So we've got our expansions array up here, so we can call expansions, and then the element we want is going to be the value of the combo box minus 1, because combo boxes start at 1 but arrays start at 0. And then we'll put a dot load data file, and our data file is data.json. I'm not sure if we need the extension on there. We'll soon find out. So I'll hit compile there. Okay, oh, we actually need to put it into our expansion data variable as well. So let's just do that. Expansion data equals. There we go. So I'll hit F5. We'll change the expansion to the clarinet. And let's see, unknown function load data file. So what have I done wrong? So, okay, so I put expansion here instead of expansions. So let's try that again. We'll change to the flute. Okay, so now it should have loaded the data file into the expansion data variable. So let's see if that worked. So we'll close that out. Where's expansion data? Expansion data is this one, and if we right click we can see it's got the range in there. So the range has been loaded in, and any other data we'd put inside this data.json file would have been loaded in as well. Okay, so we've actually got the key range now stored in expansion data. And after we grab that data, we're going to call load sample map, and then after that we're setting the key range. So because it's doing it in this order, it means by the time we get to set key colors, we've already got it loaded into expansion data. So down here in our set key colors function, let's just go back to where we were. There we are. We can now do a check. We can say if I is greater than or equal to expansion data.range, So that's the range property of our data object that we loaded in. And we want to check the first element because that's going to be the low end of the range. We say or if I is less than or equal to expansion data.range and the upper element, so the high key, then we're going to set the color of the keyboard to a different color. So let's see what colors we have. Antique white. Let's set it to antique white, and let's try 0.5 for now. So I'll hit F5. Let's see if let's change that to 0.3. Okay. 0.2. That's a bit more subtle. Okay, so something's gone wrong here because obviously it's doing it from the start and we haven't even selected from here yet the which one we want. We haven't loaded in an expansion because by default no expansion is loaded. We can see that because there's nothing in the preset browser. And we disabled this save in preset for the combo box. So where is this going wrong? So we're calling set key colors in the on init, and that is to set them to a dark color. For some reason it's also passing into this if statement. So first of all, I can see that I've set this to or, and that should be set to and. So let's see if that works. Okay, so that seems to have fixed it. So let's see, if I change clarinet, it should now color the keyboard with just the clarinet's range. And we're not actually showing the correct range here, so let's just rename that tile first of all. And if we look at the properties window over here, we can see the low key is set to 9 and the high key is set to 127. Let's change the low key to 48. Okay, so we just had the range of the keyboard display incorrect there. So now we can see the clarinet's playable range, and now if I change to the flute, we should see it update to the flute's range. There we go. So it switches between them. Like I say, this is a very simple example, so I hope you can take this idea and expand it to be a bit more useful. I'll show you an example of what I'm using it for in a little while. Okay, so that's basically it for expansions. You can explore the other expansion functions that are here. We had the load data file. There's also a write data file. You can get a sample map list if you want a list of sample maps that you have available just for this particular expansion. And that's going to come in very handy if you have more than one sample map for each expansion, which is quite likely. For example, you may have different sample maps for different articulations for the same expansion. So you'll be able to use the get sample map list just for that expansion in the same way we use the expansion's load data file just for a particular expansion. And then you can load all the corresponding sample maps into the correct samplers. The same thing goes for the get image list. You can change the images based on the expansion, and get audio file list for loading in audio files and impulse responses and things like that. Okay, so there isn't a whole lot to expansions, as you can see. I mean, it's basically that to grab the data, and then it's just what you do with the data afterwards that determines the usability of the expansions in your project. And in many cases, expansions might not even be the best way to go. If you're just making a rompler, for example, you might be able to get away with just using presets and allowing your user to add extra presets with more sample content into their existing installation. And unlike expansions, the preset browser already has a thing for importing additional presets. But the expansion system, you're going to have to roll your own installer for that, at least until something official comes along. So I'm going to save this project, and then I'm just going to show you a little bit of a project I'm working on that uses expansions. So this is very much a work in progress at the moment, but this is a player plugin I'm working on. It's got quite a complicated GUI that switches depending on what type of expansion is loaded. My expansion browser is, instead of a drop-down menu, I've got a viewport and a panel where I'm painting the names of the expansions as options. I don't know if this is how the final GUI will look, but this is what I've got for now. So you click on one and it loads up the key range as we had before. It loads in some key switches. And if we go back to the main interface, it will load up stuff with the main interface, but I think there's a bug in there at the moment. And if I go to this nylon guitar one, for example, we get a different GUI with a nice fretboard and some tabs here, different key range, more key switches, which is passed in through a data file. So you can see that with expansions and with data files, you can completely change the look of your project depending on which expansion is loaded. Again, I haven't really done anything with the GUI for this particular expansion, so that's why there's nothing there. But the guitar one's the one I've been mainly working on. Now, the actual project file for this project looks like this. And if I go into the expansions, we can see the 2 expansions are in there, same as what we had in our little demo. If I go to the nylon guitar, for example, we've got this manifest file in the additional source code directory, which I can open in a text editor. And we can see we've got multiple ranges in my case because we've got the key switch ranges as well. And we've got some patch information, we've got a list of articulations. So all of this is loaded in and then handled by the script in order to generate the GUI and generate the keyboard and generate the performance capabilities that are necessary for each expansion. So it's a lot of work, but it allows you to only put that work into a single HISE project instead of having to make and manage multiple HISE projects for different instruments. One of the tricky things about this particular scenario, which is making a player plugin, that I've found is keeping it efficient, because if you've got multiple instruments that have different needs, you might end up with some redundancy. So you've got to kind of handle that. So you can see the CPU usage here is only 1.2, 1.4%. So that's quite good. And I'm doing things like I'm turning off samplers that aren't being used. I'm putting in empty sample maps. I'm lowering the voice count to the minimum because Christoph told me that reduces the CPU usage. So if you are going to do this kind of thing, you should be conscious of disabling stuff you're not using. That includes scripts, that includes effects and samplers and whatnot. And only loading up what's necessary for each expansion. Your users will thank you for that because you'll use less system resources, and it will make your instruments perform better as well. So I hope you found this useful. My Patreon supporters of the upper Patreon levels, you will get the project folder for this demo, and you'll get the samples to go along with that. And everything I created in this video I've saved, and I'll upload that and you'll be able to access that. If you're just watching this on YouTube and you're not a Patreon supporter but you would like to be, there is a link in the description where you can find out more about that. Please click the subscribe button on YouTube if you'd like to see more videos like this, and as usual, any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.